everyone. First of all, thank you, Dr. Batra, BW, for inviting me for this keynote address for this wonderful awards function. The topic, of course, is about GCs, and I see a lot of very successful GCs before me. But right now, after the whole day and before the awards function, when I'm looking at all the people who are looking at an award, I get the feeling, I don't know, have you all seen IPL on Jio Cinema? When you open it, it's a match which is about to start, in 2 minutes you have to see the ad and get frustrated. That's me. Wait for like 15 minutes and then you all will get your awards. In terms of this whole, I was just speaking to a friend outside and talking about GC and how the GC community has grown. And when I was speaking to Ashima, I said that's something which I have had I've been most fortunate for almost 2.5 decades and more to see how this whole role has evolved. And I'll just probably share some of the experiences which I have felt and I've gone through, and I see the opportunities in GC. I actually asked them that do we have data? It's a very interesting data to see how many people over the last few years are moving from law firms into GC role. So clearly that's a very, very viable alternative now. So going back to, I probably look at GC roles in 4 phases in the last 30 or 40 years. The first phase is pre-91, where I call it the legal in-house, the support phase. And that I'm talking about before India opened up and all that, the in-house legal department was not necessarily on the top of the food chain, quite to the contrary. And they were in-house would probably, and I've also been in-house for 4 years myself, but that was later, another phase. So would be mostly doing litigation and primarily disputes work. Critical disputes in the 80s and 90s, other than financial institutions and large institutions which had very strong legal teams, would be, you would have the CEO, the CFO and so on coming in. So that was more the support phase of in-house. In-house moved, 1991 happened, new laws came in, and suddenly corporate India started transforming. And with that, even law firms started transforming. So some of us who are senior in this audience would know that prior to, in the 80s, 90s, law firms were primarily dispute solicitors and the non-litigation would be conveyance and some contracts. The transactions were few and far in between, and if there would be a CA or some advisor who would help in doing the transactions, not law firms. Post-90, what started happening, SEBI came in, markets opened up, FDI started coming in, and all of that happened suddenly, so they suddenly realized that the corporate India needed some more expertise. They started needing not only, so law firms, you see all the law firms who were there in the 90s, took that opportunity in terms of transaction and get into transaction and M&A and capital raising. But so did, when the landscape of India narrative was changing, so did the in-house role. So the in-house roles shifted from support to almost what I call, this time, problem spotter. And I'll tell you why. So this is the time suddenly in-house legal started getting involved in transactional work. This is the 90s. And in the transactional work, because till then it was litigation work and not leading it, the large transaction, they were involved, but they were not the GCs of today leading large transactions. When I say problem spotter, because the regulatory framework was far more complicated, it started that in-house legal teams were looking at risks. And this was a phase when laws again started changing, and the business guys used to come and say, "Arey," and I've been a part of that. I don't want to say no, I want to know what is the solution. Find me a solution. And that's when they slowly actually segued into the third phase, which is the solution provider. And suddenly you have these GCs who became a solution provider, and the phrase which I call the facilitator phase. The facilitator phase suddenly saw a huge and a long transformation where GCs, and I must say that because as I said, I was in-house myself for a time, of course, earlier part of my career, and some of my closest friends are still on that side. Where this phase, and I'm speaking from on the other side now as a lawyer, when I see and interact with them, and this phase went on for some time where GC says we are a solution, we need to land the plane, We need to find solutions. And that interestingly went on for a long time, till about 2013, 14, 15. Interestingly, I was just reading an anecdote in a data where a GC time spent, 70% is spent on transactional work and 30% on governance work. And that's what I see the fourth phase that we are coming into, which is the leadership phase. So from the support phase to the problems, problem spotter phase, to the facilitator or solution finder, to now I see for the last 5-6 years, a transformative change where the whole GC role is evolving very drastically. So I have some very close friends in GC where I suddenly see that they are taking leadership positions in organizing. I see some of you here who are doing that, probably a lot of you here, where I suddenly see that GCs are part of strategic decisions. GCs are part of suddenly the whole narrative. So what happened in 2013 was when the Companies Act came and this whole discussion on governance and LODR came in after a few years, and so much that the whole decision on what will the GCs do in the leadership. So then came the discussion on governance. In its truest sense today, if you look at a construct of the company, you've got the CEO who looks after the business, you've got the company secretary, you've got the CFO. No one really, so CS looks after, unless they of course fold into one, a company secretary and legal, but just purely company secretary if I look at, and if I look at CFO role or some CMO role, there is really no role which actually says who is the flag bearer of governance framework or the governance narrative of the company. And more often than not, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen some of the large, both internationally, MNCs and large corporates in India, that it's the GCs who are doing the role, the in-house legal who are actually driving that narrative. I'll give you a few examples. So earlier, when I said that the general counsels or in-house was involved in large litigation or large transactions, I see now in-house legal deciding even on new products, how the communication happens in a company, how even an internal campaign, actually a GC is sitting on and deciding how the internal campaign will go, because the GC is deciding that this is the way I want to ensure the company's brand is built. And if I want to say that, so there is, of course, I see, one is in transaction and strategic. So there was few days back a kickoff meeting with the first discussion, and I was not there, the first discussion of a fairly large merger. The first discussion started with the CEO, the chairman, and the GC. The CFO also wasn't there. Okay, so that's the level. In terms of leadership roles, why I say governance and why I say they are the flag bearers of governance is because finally today in a communication that GCs do a communication, the entire role, whether it is product, so nowadays when I see, and I'm speaking of some people that I interact with, and I'm sure, and some of you are sitting in this room, as I said, and and I'm sure this would be applicable to all. So what you wouldn't see 5 or 6 years earlier, you suddenly see GCs are completely clued on the company's product, the company's financials, so even discussions on investor relations, I've seen, other than the chairman of the investor relation committee, they take the GC. They say that, let me know what the discussion we need to have. Not of course, the company secretary and CFO usually goes. There is a discussion with investors. The discussion, as I said, with campaign. The whole campaign of GCs driving or general counsels driving that the whole narrative, we want to change the whole communication of the company into, the whole transparency, fair disclosures, and that's the drive, not only internal and external. And with this whole push on governance, I see this role, and like as I said, law firms in India have also grown. I mean, phenomenally grown in over the last 30 years. As a natural corollary, I see in-house legal growing also. And it'll keep on happening more and more and more. You see that in the US, you see how important large and top company GCs are. It's just natural that GCs will come into India in that space. In that, I've actually also seen effectively team leaders. So and I said there was nothing, it was a discussion. I said I'll speak of experiences. And if that's the role, I'm happy to see, and I see that there are leaderships being coming out of GCs. They are effectively the ones who are also advising boards. And a lot of, especially in the, I don't know if some of you all have been dealing with this whole NEFRA 14312, a lot of disclosure requirement. I see a lot of that happening suddenly. And a lot of GCs are suddenly, driving that whole narrative, discussing with, of course, law firms as, and the forensic experts, and how effectively they've become almost the main sounding board for all boards now. It's not the CFO. If it's a CS alone, no. If it's a GC, and from the top of my mind, I can think of, as I speak, 5 or 6 very large companies where now automatically the CEO, the chairman of the board, the chairman of the audit committee, the first call goes to the general counsel. And I think that's only going to increase as I see the participation of law firms and increase of law firms. And I see that's something which is going to increase. I would say few things which stands out for me when I see GCs. One is it's really impressive when GCs know their business. And I've seen a lot now that when GCs know their financials, their ratios, their financial ratios, their product, their marketing, they're very clear because they're almost sitting at the top of the table. Second is when they are thinking about the institution first. And that's a tricky part because we are in a country where we have not necessarily a lot of diversified, they're promoter-written, CEO-driven, promoter-driven companies. But as long as firmly, softly, you need not. And on that, especially in that 14312 or disclosure requirements, there are 2 types I've seen a lot, especially one, and I'm not saying GCs, I'm saying generally people both in-house, out-house, especially issues, which is a whistleblower issue. On one extreme, we see people who will shout murder, murder, murder for the smallest whistleblower. On the other, you'll see people who's actually there's murder and say, kuch nahi hua hai. I think general counsel role, in especially governance, is the maturity to handle it with a fine balance. And not say on one hand, the world's on fire, there's World War III happening, or completely casual and put it under the carpet. I think, and that's what, the GC position has evolved. These are, I'm not saying it myself, these are what I've experienced. These are my interaction with our fraternity, people from your fraternity there. I won't hold you back any longer. I was just told to give a talk and want to keep it very, very, very brief because we've overshot significantly. Happy to meet some of you all after the event. Thank you very much, and many, many congratulations to all the people who've won the awards. Thank you so much.